for this deep dive, I'm going to review the book by Father James Martin, which I finished reading, called Work in Progress. So if you're like me, I'm sure you're wondering, what's your life's calling? What does God want you to do? Well, I just finished an interview with Father James Martin, the famous Jesuit, and I've done some research, and I see a great intersection between his story and the founding of the Dominican order in the United States, who produced this podcast. And I'm Steve Yusko, your host. So, when you're thinking about your calling, do you expect like this cinematic, masterful moment on top of a mountain where somebody hands you the resume and say, hey, here's the keys to your life? Or maybe you have like the burning bush, blinding flash of clarity where the heavens open up, the angels sing, and somebody just hands you the plan for your ultimate destiny. We all want a revelation that's kind of dramatic, I guess, something that's going to separate us from our boring everyday routines. We just want to be rescued from the mundane. But when you step into the real world of social and spiritual vocation, you look around and suddenly that pristine mountaintop is really nowhere to be found. Nowhere. Instead, you're starting at a landscape covered in dirty dishes or mistrained connections or agonizing over that Excel spreadsheet at work. And that's exactly why the research I've done on both Father Martin and the Dominican Sisters of Amityville, and I think you're really going to appreciate the link that we're going to expose for you. So in essence, for this deep dive, I'm going to review the book by Father James Martin, which I finished reading, called Work in Progress. And I want to read the full description because I think it's great. It's confessions of a busboy, dishwasher, caddy, usher, factory worker, bank teller, corporate tool, and finally priest. I'm also going to look at some of the historical records of the Dominican Sisters of Amityville and talk about the future of what's happening within the church, particularly with religious orders and the invitation we have for you, our audience. So as we weave things together here, we're going to find how the boring and mundane, in some cases, disastrous cuts of our lives. So here's the argument. It's that everyday labor, even our most spectacular logistical failures, aren't actually keeping us from our true work. All right, let's jump right into Father James Martin. I just finished an interview with him. We talked about his book. We talked about the church and life and his laughter and him being a Jesuit. Definitely check that out at the end of this video. So if you aren't familiar with Father James Martin, his background is not exactly what you would expect from a high-profile Jesuit priest. Really not at all. We're talking about a guy who graduated from the Wharton School of Business in 1982, spent 6 years ruthlessly climbing the corporate finance ladder at GE and GE Capital. In the 1980s, that was a really competitive, high-stakes environment. He was deeply embedded in the corporate machine, evaluating multi-million-dollar deals. He had achieved what might be the American dream of monetary success and corporate prestige. But this memoir reveals that he realized that the monetary success didn't equal to any sort of spiritual or personal fulfillment. It just felt hollow to him. So in 1988, he just walks away from the corporate world and enters the Jesuit order. It's a massive pivot. That brings us to the book itself. It's called A Work in Progress. The brilliance of the title, it actually is operating on three distinct levels simultaneously. First, it refers to Martin himself. He's acknowledging that he just hasn't arrived. He's still learning and growing. Second, it's directed at you, the reader, reminding you of your own life as an ongoing project or spiritual journey or unfinished spiritual journey. And third, it's a very literal description of the chronological progression of his odd jobs before and during his vocation. He creates these incredible, vivid scenes. He talks about an early babysitting gig where the absolute hardest part was watching TV and drinking some Tang. Remember Tang, that orange drink that went up with the astronauts? He's humorous and it's light. But then he contrasts that with the grueling, mind-numbing reality of being a factory worker or standing in the sweltering humid kitchen for hours as a dishwasher covered in grease. You know what he's doing? He's deliberately highlighting the entire spectrum of human labor, from the absurdly easy to the physically crushing. As he says in the book, How hard can it be? Now I have to push back a little here. Is James Martin just looking back with rose-colored glasses with nostalgia at minimum wage jobs? Is there actual tangible spiritual value in scrubbing pots? Or is it just a nice story we tell ourselves to feel better about our daily grind? That is a crucial distinction to make, and the answer really lies in a foundational theological concept that Martin champions. It's called incarnation spirituality. Stripped of the jargon, it's the idea that absolutely nothing human is foreign to God. Nothing. God just doesn't exist in the quiet, pristine environment of a cathedral or on that metaphorical mountaintop we talked about earlier. God meets us exactly in the middle of the ordinary, sometimes in the agonizing routine. It's about finding the sacred in the dirt. Martin isn't romanticizing the pain or the low wages of menial labor. He's arguing that the humility and the shared human struggle experienced in those environments taught him more about grace than any high-level corporate seminar at GE ever could. Standing over a sink of dirty dishes alongside someone who's really just trying to feed their family. That strips away the ego in a way that corporate success tries to build it up. It really makes a lot of sense, especially when you look at how it set the stage for what came next in his life. The menial labor was basically a boot camp for his actual Jesuit ministries. He just didn't stay in the kitchen. He went out to the margins. I looked at his work, serving at a hospice in Jamaica and with the Missionaries of Charity, working directly with street gangs in the housing projects of Chicago, and helping East African refugees in Kenya. Let's look more closely at his time in Kenya at the Mukono Center, because this is where you see the synthesis of his entire life up to that point. He didn't just show up to preach a sermon to the refugees. He recognized that these people needed a sustainable livelihood. So he took his Wharton finance background, all those corporate skills that he thought he left behind, and applied them to the refugees and taught them how to build small businesses. He was translating the corporate supply chain logistics and profit and loss statements into literal surviving tools to build up the people of Kenya. And the through line through all this, whether he was in hospice or in a refugee camp, is a philosophy he describes simply as standing with the vulnerable. He calls it practicing an aestheticism of kindness. Now, aestheticism usually implies self-discipline like fasting or giving up worldly goods. So an aestheticism of kindness means being rigorously, uncompromisingly kind, always being compassionate, always being helpful, no matter the circumstance. Hey, let's be honest. Kindness looks great. It's a fantastic bumper sticker. But looking at his public life, things are really brutal for him. The media polarization, as we know today, is insane. Specifically, as I looked into his background, his critics specifically reference his outreach to the LGBTQ plus community and his book, Building a Bridge. I read that book, and I strongly suggest you check it out. There was a severe, relentless pushback from what is described as the Catholic hard right. They were very clear about accusing him of causing spiritual turmoil, bishops writing public warnings, and a generally scorched earth media landscape. Hey, I can personally attest to this. When I was in the seminary studying to be a permanent deacon, I was cautioned about reading Father Martin's book. So, how on earth does a rigorous aestheticism of kindness actually survive in an environment where people are aggressively and publicly trying to tear you down? It's got to be the hardest part. If we look impartially at what's been reported, we see deep structural ideological divisions within the church regarding moral teachings and modern outreach. His critics argue that Martin's approach causes confusion about established doctrine. But from Martin's perspective, he views his work as something called pre-evangelization. What does that mean exactly? What do you do before evangelizing? It means you have to create a space of welcome and security before you can even start any theological or doctrinal dialogue. If someone feels marginalized, attacked, or fundamentally unwelcome, they literally can't hear the message. They're in survival mode. So what's Martin's survival mechanism in this hyperpolarized landscape? I'll tell you what it is. It's heavily rooted in the Jesuit principle called Ignatian presupposition. The Ignatian presupposition demands that you give your neighbor's words the most favorable interpretation possible, even when facing intense public criticism. It's tough. The aestheticism of kindness demands that you do not return fire for fire. No eye for an eye, no tooth for a tooth. In practice, you listen, you accompany, and you maintain the dignity of the other person, regardless of how wide the ideological divide is. You can kind of think of it as a conversational shock absorber. When a critic throws a digital hand grenade, he uses the Ignatian presupposition to actively search for that tiny grain of legitimate concern in their attack. Maybe it's their fear for the church or their confusion, and he addresses that. It completely disarms the conflict because he just refuses to match the hostility. You could see it. I saw it in his demeanor when I interviewed him, and I've seen it on his many appearances on Stephen Colbert and the various news programs like CNN and MSNBC. You know, kindness isn't just a mood. It's a highly disciplined, tactical approach to keeping the door open, building a bridge. It requires immense restraint. And boy, I try to work on that myself. So Martin's whole realization is that you have to meet people in the dirt, in the messiness of their reality, whether it's a housing project in Chicago or a toxic comment online. And that idea actually connects flawlessly to the other half of what I'm going to go into today. Because meeting people in the messy reality of the margins wasn't just Father Martin's personal epiphany. It's exactly the same survival mechanism that an entire community of nuns used to stay alive and thrive back in 1853. So what happened? In 1853, German nuns came to the United States with the intention of traveling to Pennsylvania to help recent German immigrants really survive. What happened? Well, what actually happened is the whole logistics got screwed up. The priest that was supposed to pick them up never showed up at the dock, and they were stranded. Imagine the sheer panic of that moment. It had to be terrifying. You're completely displaced in a brand new country. You likely don't speak the language well, and your carefully constructed plan was just left in ruins. They were quite literally stuck on the docks. They ended up taking shelter in a rectory basement in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. Imagine what that was like. They lived there before eventually moving out to a farm in Amityville on Long Island in the 1870s, thus becoming the Dominican Sisters of Amityville. You know, it was that disastrous travel itinerary that accidentally birthed a massive movement for social good. But here's the thing that keeps on tripping me up. They're part of the Order of Preachers. Now, when you hear Order of Preachers, you immediately think of a guy standing at a wooden pulpit talking to a congregation on a Sunday morning. So how does the concept of preaching translate to a group of immigrant nuns living in a basement and then working on a farm here on Long Island? To understand that, we have to talk about their specific charism. Now, charism can be really a churchy word, but think of a charism as an organization's unique spiritual DNA. It's the specific gift or focus that a religious order brings to the world. For example, the Franciscans, their charism might be radical poverty and care for creation. For the Dominicans, their charism is holy preaching. But for these sisters, preaching is not restricted to liturgical oratory. It's not just about talking. Holy preaching is living testimony. The sisters are called to be signs of joy and hope through what they call active contemplative life. And let me tell you, I've spent some time this past year with the Dominicans, and their joy is palatable. You just got to be in their presence to experience it. So, you know what? They're really just not cloistered away behind some wall praying all day, completely separated from society. Far from it. They operate on 4 pillars: prayer, study, community, and mission. And then we're going to get into the 4 energy centers that correspond to that in the We Move Forward Together initiative. So think of it this way. The prayer and the study are fuel. The community is the engine, and the mission is where the rubber meets the road. What's really beautiful, and I just realized about their origin story, you know, that massive logistical failure at the docks really became their ultimate superpower because they personally experienced displacement, marginalization, and the vulnerability of being immigrants. It became the exact catalyst for a legacy built on solidarity with the poor and the newcomer. They didn't preach from a pulpit. They preached by sheltering orphans, teaching fellow immigrants, and working the land. They incarnated the gospel just like Martin talks about. They met God in the dirt of the Amityville farm. So that brings us to what are they doing now? Because as we look at the sociological analysis in their history, they've brought together some highly specific modern ministries that are really incredibly impactful. They run Dominican Village, treating the whole person, ensuring that the elderly aren't just physically kept alive, but are truly seen, valued, and integrated into a community. At Dominican Village, they are treating the whole person, not just the biological machine. And that's huge. It's transformative. Let's also dig into their corporate stance specifically regarding climate change. They've joined up with other congregations to commit to sustainable life habits and to advocate for policies protecting the environment. You know, it's incredibly trendy right now for corporations and organizations to issue corporate stances on things like climate change. It's called greenwashing, right? It's very easy to write a press release and call it a day. So how do we know that these sisters aren't just doing the religious equivalent of greenwashing? You know what? They're actually doing the heavy lifting. It's a fair question because talk is cheap these days, but the evidence and the analysis points to them doing the heavy lifting, literally, physically lifting the dirt. Their theological beliefs manifest in their actual relationship to the land they own. For example, in direct response to Pope Francis's encyclical on the environment, they allowed their homecoming farm, which they actually cultivated for the past 27 years, they let it rest. They let the dirt, the soil, regenerate itself by growing grasses and wildflowers. So just like Father Martin, this is where I see the connection, where Father Martin used his Wharton corporate training to help the refugees build businesses, and then to run his editorial side of America Magazine. The sisters were using their institutional organization, their land rights, and their corporate power to deliver highly localized, tangible care to the earth and to vulnerable people. What they're doing is they're taking high-level theology and translating it into rent assistance for refugee families, English lessons for newly arrived mother, or preserving a 10-acre field for native bees. It's an incredible legacy. But it also brings us to the elephant in the room. What about the future? Both Father Martin and the sisters recognize that populations are aging and religious institutions, especially in the Catholic Church, are facing massive demographic shifts. The numbers of vowed religious men and women are definitely changing. So how do they ensure the work doesn't just fade away with history? The answer is they evolve. That brings us to We Move Forward Together, or the WMFT initiative. It's a critical, fascinating evolution for the congregation itself. WMFT is actively inviting the laity, meaning you, everyday people like you and me, who haven't taken religious vows, to share in their mission. They've established groups like the Dominican Associates, Dominican Young Adults, and massive volunteer networks, all participating in the work of spirituality, ecology, community, and social justice. Those are the 4 energy centers. And they're embracing new ways of communicating all of this. That's why we have the podcast. But let's be totally pragmatic for a second. Is We Move Forward Together just another clever rebranding effort? Is it a survival tactic to keep the lights on? We can look at this cynically, but if we synthesize everything we've discovered today, from Father Martin's book to the history of what happened on the docks in 1853 and the beginning of the order here in the United States, it's undeniable, a genuine evolution of their original mission. Just think about it. The core of the Dominican charism is holy preaching through living testimony. But nowhere does it say that only vowed nuns in habits can preach with their lives. We Move Forward Together is actually the ultimate real-world realization of what Father Martin is arguing in his memoir, Work in Progress. Martin's entire thesis is that everyone, the reader, the busboy, the corporate tool, the listener of the deep dive, is on a spiritual journey. God meets us in the mundane, regardless of our job title or where we've taken our vows. The sisters aren't just trying to save a 19th century institution. They're democratizing their charism. They're looking at the public and say, you don't need to be a nun to care for the earth. You don't need a theology degree to teach an immigrant how to read. You don't need a pulpit to advocate for the marginalized. They are actively inviting you, the listener, into a regenerative community. And by the way, I want you to comment. You have a connection to the Dominicans. If you see something here, something sparking your imagination, we'll connect you with someone here in this Dominican order. There's so many wonderful men and women who support the cause, and we want to hear from you. So comment. We respond to every comment that we get. So what are the sisters doing? They're really taking the walls down and expanding the tent. It perfectly kind of mirrors Martin's point. You are a work in progress, and your daily life is the mission field. Let's recap on the synergy discovered here, because it really is so striking. We started with Father James Martin, a guy who walked away from a lucrative, prestigious corporate finance desk to find grace in scrubbing greasy dishes, and later used his finance skills to walk with gang members and refugees. And we looked at the Dominican Sisters, who started as 4 stranded, terrified immigrants in a Brooklyn basement, which evolved into a powerhouse of social and ecological justice right here on Long Island. Both stories prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the sacred isn't reserved for the mountaintop. Not at all. It's found in the daily grind, in the dirt, and on the margins. And true preaching isn't always done with words. It's done through action, through solidarity, through the unrelenting aestheticism of kindness. So here is the provocative thought I want to leave with you today. Think back to that opening image we talked about, the expectation of a perfect cinematic destiny. If a Wharton executive can find profound grace, life's ultimate calling, and if 4 displaced nuns can accidentally build a century-long legacy of community care because their travel itinerary failed completely on the docks, what is seemingly a failed plan, what could be a frustrating detour, we all have that in our lives, or what incredible mundane task in your life right now may be the hidden foundation for your next great work. I'm Steve Yusko with We Move Forward Together. Please hit that like button, get off that mountaintop, get out to the margins, and let's get working and make some good trouble. All right. Hey, check out my interview with Father James Martin. You can find it right here. All right. Be well, everyone.